Jeff Smith, I want to go to you first. You're in D.C. You're tracking the mood in the Biden administration and in the U.S. Congress. Can you give our viewers a sense of how the Biden administration has been gearing up? We've heard some very bullish comments from senior officials in the Biden administration in the build-up to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Washington, D.C. How much of that is hype and how much of that is America really getting set to take the India relationship to the next gear?
I think it's more than hype. As a longtime advocate for India-U.S. relations, I have to date been pleasantly surprised that the Biden administration has put value on this relationship, has taken time and effort to expand the relationship, to elevate the Quad grouping, and to pursue new forms of cooperation with India, breaking new boundaries. If reports are to be believed, we are looking at potentially signing a jet engine agreement that even a few years ago would have been a non-starter, that many of my Indian and frankly American friends would have told me is not a possibility, is not on the table. And all of a sudden, many things that were not a possibility years ago, from bringing the Quad back to signing the foundational agreements to talking about jet engine technology transfer and cooperation, suddenly these are on the table. And so I do give the Biden administration some credit for how it's approached the relationship. And I believe that there is more substance here, that it's not just the usual hype and talk.
And some of this, Ambassador Bhambavle, has happened despite India taking positions on matters of global affairs which haven't gone down well with DC. For example, buying oil from Russia, not taking an open position in the way that the United States would want on the Russia-Ukraine war, even though the Prime Minister says in that interview he just gave that we're on the side of peace. Washington would like India to do more. So despite navigating a very tricky balance, both these countries have been able to find commonalities, be able to build on the foundations. You know, if you compare this with Manmohan Singh's visit at the time of George W. Bush in 2005, which is when the civil nuclear deal was announced, how would this visit, a state visit by the Prime Minister to DC, rank when compared with past Prime Ministerial visits to the United States, Ambassador Bhambavle?
That's an excellent question, Rahul, because the current trajectory in India-US relations dates back almost 20-odd years. We have seen 4 separate Prime Ministers of India, starting with Prime Minister Vajpayee, then Manmohan Singh, now Modi, 3 separate Prime Ministers, and 4 separate presidents on the US side. George W. Bush, followed, of course, by President Obama, Trump, and now Biden. So this is a long-term trajectory in Indo-US relations, but the current visit by Prime Minister Modi is essentially about transfer of technology, as has been said by some of the other speakers. The fact that the United States is today, and US companies, the US government, the whole of the United States is willing and ready to share fairly high levels of technology and transfer that technology to India is what distinguishes this visit by Prime Minister Modi. And when we look back on this visit, I have no doubt that it will be seen as an inflection point, as yet another inflection point in the bilateral relationship between the 2 biggest and largest democracies of the world. And that this will be looked back as the visit which moved the relationship into a higher orbit or a higher trajectory.
Raymond Bikri, your sense by speaking to US congressmen, by looking at the comments that they made in the build-up to the visit, because, for example, with the jet engine deal, it's not just the Biden administration. After that, congressional approval is required, and unless there is adequate bipartisan support, many of these announcements by the US administration could potentially get held up in the US political process. Are you seeing enough bipartisan support to be able to push through some of these ideas that the 2 governments seem to be working on at the moment?
Well, thanks for having me. I think that it's true that one of the few areas of bipartisan cooperation in the United States Congress between Republicans and Democrats is on the U.S.-India relationship. So that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, that we have problems of our own in terms of the coming presidential election, the whole question of the respect for rule of law, in regard to former President Trump and so forth. So yes, it is perfectly possible. You may recall that in 2005 with the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal, which I worked very hard on in favor of getting that through the Congress, it took basically a year and a half to be able to get that from the concept all the way through the Congress. The first thing that was sent to the Congress from the administration was dead on arrival. And so it had to be revised and it had to be worked through the political process. But having said that, this is some commonality which India and the U.S. have, in that we are both great democracies. We both have our own domestic trajectories to deal with, but that's a part of the price of freedom, respect for the rule of law, in going forward, as opposed to dictatorships or authoritarian systems such as in China and in Russia. So the good news is, yeah, it can be held up, but the trajectory is good. And you will note from the Twitter comments, both Republican and Democrat, that there is great approval and really joy in having the opportunity to welcome Prime Minister Modi to the United States and to Washington, D.C. in the next couple of days.
John Venable is the Senior Research Fellow, Defense Policy at the Center for National Defense, the Davis Institute for National and Foreign Policy. John, on the Predator deal, now this is the deadly killer drones that India has been wanting to buy. Would there be, in your view, an element of transfer of technology on that deal as well, which is slated to be about $3 billion with General Atomics, or is that just a buyer-seller transactional relationship? Because one of the reasons why India preferred in the past decades to buy from the United States, from the USSR and later from Russia, is because weapons were bought at lesser than market rates and came with a very significant component of transfer of technology.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for having me. As you're aware, the Indian military currently is operating the Guardian. It's a version of the MQ-9, and that is more or less on a test basis right now with the Indian government as to how they see the system actually being integrated into their military surveillance infrastructure. A bigger deal going into a transfer of technology would involve the same process that this F414 engine has gone through, and that would be significant. The technology behind the MQ-9, how it's operating, boxes and the likes work and come together, would be another debate, and that would be something that would have to go through the ITAR process.